This video on Ireland's immigration, really interesting stuff. People talk about open borders, but it's usually theoretical. And, well, this Tracey O'Mahony, she's a barrister, so we're seeing the legal angle, which I think is super helpful.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. She gets right into the nitty-gritty of how Ireland is actually managing this influx of people. Like, look at Thornton Hall, for instance.
Right, that's that 162-acre site there, converting it to house over 1,000 migrants.
Exactly. And it's not just housing. They're providing 24/7 staffing, catered meals, healthcare. She even makes point that these are all single adult males being housed together.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't even considered that, kind of the social dynamic of that kind of concentration of, is that common, housing migrants in those large single demographic facilities?
That's a good question. Something to, maybe look into further. But for now, I think what O'Mahony is doing is she's contrasting this level of provision with, the struggles that a lot of average Irish citizens are facing, especially with the housing crisis.
Yeah, it makes you wonder about the resource allocation. Like, is that truly sustainable? And she says Thornton Hall is just one piece of this.
Right. It's part of a much bigger strategy. The Irish government is, they're actively converting state-owned properties all across the country to accommodate, they call them international protection applicants, which, by the way, isn't just asylum seekers. It also includes people seeking other forms of protection under international law. So
okay, so it's a broader net than I think a lot of people realize initially, and they're even willing to bypass existing planning laws to make this happen.
Yeah, and that's a key point that O'Mahony brings up. This she talks about pensioners facing legal issues over small dwellings while the government is kind of sidestepping those regulations for migrant housing. She specifically mentions that they're bypassing Sections 3 and 4 of the Planning and Development Act, which is, caused a lot of debate.
Wow, so a potential legal gray area and a kind of the optics of a two-tiered system, I can see why this is striking a nerve. But how many people are we even talking about here?
Well, O'Mahony cites a target of 35,000 migrants annually. And this is where the long-term implications really come into play, because she points out that the deportation rate in Ireland is shockingly low, less than 1.5%.
Wait, less than 1.5%? So even if only a fraction of those seeking asylum are successful, the numbers could still balloon over time?
Exactly. And then O'Mahony takes it a step further by saying, okay, what about family reunification? She argues that if even half of those granted asylum bring over family members, that 35,000 could easily multiply by 5. Even tenfold.
And then it's not even just the logistics of housing, right? It's the strain on social services, infrastructure, like the financial burden alone must be massive.
She puts a figure on it. 5 million euros per day to support asylum seekers. That's about 1.8 billion euros annually. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of Ireland's entire defense budget.
I mean, that's just an incredible amount of money. And especially with, like you said, Ireland already dealing with the housing crisis, healthcare system is strained as it is, cost of living, is it even sustainable?
And this is where O'Mahony brings up, the economist Milton Friedman. He has that famous quote, you cannot have open borders in a welfare state.
Yeah.
And she's essentially arguing that, something's got to give.
But isn't Ireland, obligated to provide certain levels of support under international law? And how does this even compare to how other European countries who are, they're facing similar challenges, right? How are they handling this?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And O'Mahony's point is that Ireland is kind of becoming an outlier here. She points to other European nations that are actually going in the opposite direction. They're tightening their immigration policies. They're concerned about the strain on their own social system. So
they're seeing these same pressures. Financial, social, cultural, and they're taking a different approach. What are they like? What are some of these different approaches that they're taking?
Well, some countries are implementing much stricter border controls. Others are putting more emphasis on integration into the workforce, to kind of offset that financial burden. There's this growing debate about how to create a sustainable model. And O'Mahony really seems to be saying that, what Ireland's doing right now, it might not be it.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, there is this moral obligation to offer refuge to people who are, fleeing very real hardship and danger. But at the same time, you have to consider the long-term well-being of your own citizens and the sustainability of your social systems.
Right. And O'Mahony highlights that tension really well, especially when she brings up the statistic that, get this, less than 100 out of over 7,000 rejected asylum seekers were actually deported from Ireland last year.
Wow. That's a really low number. It makes you wonder if deportation isn't effectively addressing those who don't qualify for asylum. What does that say about the government's ability to actually manage this influx, and what are the long-term consequences of that?
Yeah, it raises a lot of questions about, the effectiveness of the current system. And it kind of brings us back to the core of O'Mahony's argument.
This idea that, Ireland's current approach is creating this unsustainable tension between open borders and a robust welfare state.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just some abstract economic debate either.
Because it really does directly impact the lives of everyday Irish citizens.
Absolutely. I mean, the same people who are, facing that housing crisis, the long wait times for healthcare, the rising cost of living, they're the ones who are going to be, most affected by the strain on social services.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated because, like I said, on a human level, wanting to offer refuge, that makes perfect sense. But then you have these practical questions about sustainability, and those are huge.
And what I think is so important about O'Mahony's video, she doesn't shy away from the social and cultural dimensions of this either. She kind of touches on them briefly towards the end, but it's enough to, get you thinking.
Right. It's not just about the economics. It's also about, what kind of society does Ireland want to be? You have this influx of people from all these diverse backgrounds, with different values, different expectations. How does that impact social cohesion? How does that impact, cultural identity?
And those are questions that every nation grapples with, I think, to some extent. But it does feel particularly pointed for a country like Ireland, with such a strong sense of its own history and identity.
It's like she's saying, look, I'm not opposed to helping people, but we need to be honest about the challenges, and we need to have a real plan for integration for this to work. Like, you can't just assume that it will all work itself out.
Yeah. And I think that honesty, that willingness to ask the hard questions, it's what's missing from a lot of the public discourse around immigration. It's so often presented as this very simple, you're either for open borders or you're against it.
Right. When the reality is it's a lot messier, it's a lot more nuanced. And I think those nuances are what we've really tried to kind of unpack in this deep dive.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this video you shared so valuable, because it's not offering these easy answers. It's forcing us to actually confront how complex this issue really is and the very real trade-offs that are involved.
And to bring it back to you, the listener, I think the takeaway here isn't about, taking sides. It's about informed consideration.
Exactly. What O'Mahony has done is she's given us this framework for thinking critically about these issues, right? She's shown us one perspective backed up by data and legal arguments.
Now, it's really up to each of us to do our own research, consider other viewpoints, and ultimately kind of reach our own conclusions about what a sustainable and compassionate approach to immigration might actually look like, not just for Ireland, but for the world.
Because one thing is for sure, this is not an issue that's going away anytime soon.
No, not by a long shot. So keep asking those tough questions. Stay engaged with this debate, and never underestimate the power of informed perspective. It really is a complex issue because, like you said, on a human level, wanting to help, it's easy to say, yes, let's offer refuge, but then you have these much bigger questions about can we actually sustain this? And those are big questions.
Yeah, and I think what's really valuable in O'Mahony's video is she doesn't just focus on the economics, she also brings up the social and cultural side of this, which, she doesn't spend a ton of time on it, but she brings it up, which is, gets you thinking.
Right, and that's really important. It's not just about, can we afford this? It's what kind of society are we looking at the other end of this, right? When you have this influx of people from, all different backgrounds, different values, different expectations, how does that impact social cohesion? How does that impact, our sense of cultural identity?
Yeah. And those are questions I think every nation kind of has to wrestle with to some extent. But it's particularly, it feels very relevant in a place like Ireland, with such a strong sense of its own history and identity.
Yeah, it's almost like she's saying, look, I want to help people, right? But we have to at least acknowledge these very real challenges and actually have a plan for how this is going to work long term. It's not enough to just say, well, we'll figure it out. It'll work itself out.
Absolutely. And I think it's that honesty, that willingness to to really ask those tough questions. It's something that we don't see a lot of in just the public conversation around immigration.
Yeah.
It often feels like you have to pick a side. Right?
Yeah.
You're either for open borders or you're completely against it.
Right. And the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more nuanced. And those nuances are really what we've, tried to unpack a bit here with this deep dive.
I think that's what's so great about this video. It doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it does make you think about just how complicated it is and the the trade-offs involved. It's not simple.
Yeah, for sure. And to bring it back to you, the listener, what I hope you take away from this isn't, which side to pick. It's really about taking the time to really understand the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. If anything, O'Mahony has given us a framework to start thinking critically about this stuff. She's, shown us one perspective. She's got the data. She's coming at it from this legal perspective, which is really helpful.
And now it's up to each of us to do a little bit more digging, maybe, hear some other perspectives on this and ultimately decide for ourselves what a sustainable and compassionate approach to this really looks like, not just for Ireland, but, for the world, really.
Yeah, because if one thing's for sure, this is not going away. This is something we're all going to be dealing with for a long time.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, keep those tough questions coming, stay engaged in these important conversations and never underestimate the power of being informed.
Couldn't agree more. It's on all of us to stay informed and keep those conversations going.